6 figures. That's the going rate a single frame of Meghan Markle stepping onto British soil with her 2 children would fetch on the open tabloid market. A seasoned Fleet Street royal reporter tossed out that number without hesitation when pressed, and the receipts back him up. Rewind to 1992, when Sarah Ferguson was caught off guard by a lens in the south of France. That one set of pictures moved for a full 1 million. Lock that figure into the front of your mind, because what reportedly unfolded across Northamptonshire during the second week of July 2025 completely dismantles the pricing logic behind it. By the time this breakdown wraps up, I'll walk you through who was really behind the phone on that island, why the hush coming out of Althorp estate speaks louder than any press release ever could, and the single historical footnote about Princess Diana herself that flips everything the commentary crowd got wrong this week completely on its head. But first, the water. Nestled quietly on the grounds of Althorp Estate in Northamptonshire lies a stretch of water that, from any distance, looks like a modest ornamental lake. Nothing striking. The sort of landscape feature you'd stroll past on any English country estate without a second glance. Except, drifting at its heart, there's a small piece of land that no living soul can walk to. No bridge spans across it, no path leads to its edge. Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, ordered the crossing physically ripped out years ago, and he explained his logic with no room for misreading. The water, in his own framing, exists to keep out what he described as the deranged and the morbid. The waterlogged ground below adds a second layer of resistance for anyone stubborn enough to try wading over. This isn't decoration. This isn't landscape design. This is a fortress built around the resting place of his sister, Diana, Princess of Wales. 4 separate times over roughly 2 decades, people attempted to physically reach those remains. 4 documented breaches. Charles Spencer personally shut down every single one. That's the origin story of that water barrier. That's why the bridge disappeared. Not for aesthetics, not for garden design, but because someone kept trying to reach a body. Now hold that picture in your head. An island engineered to be unreachable, watched over by a man who has treated it as a personal duty for nearly 3 decades. Because what reportedly unfolded during the second week of July shatters every foundation that setup was built upon. Last Thursday, Meghan Markle dropped 11 images onto her Instagram feed. Nested inside that gallery sat one photograph in particular that exploded across every platform within hours. A father walking with 2 small children down a tree-lined path. He carries flowers. His son carries some of his own. They're framed from behind, no faces on display. The setting is unmistakably Althorp. I've been turning that specific image over in my head for close to a full week, studied it from every possible angle, and my conclusions veer significantly away from the dominant conversation that dominated social media all week. Here's what everybody else fixated on. Taste. Whether the post crossed a line, whether it felt exploitative, whether it fit patterns that critics of the Duchess of Sussex had long anticipated. That entire debate, every strand of it, sails right past something far more foundational that's been sitting there in plain view the whole time. Somebody had to physically ferry a recording device, or at bare minimum a smartphone, across water that was specifically engineered to prevent exactly that kind of access. Somebody needed clearance, permission, a boat, a code, an invitation. Whatever mechanism actually governs entry to that island, which leaves one obvious question dangling over this entire affair. And it's the question I haven't seen a single commentator chase down properly. Who granted entry? Here's the part most people are getting completely backwards, and it's the thread I want to pull hardest in this whole breakdown, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Before we even reach the flowers or the posting or the timing, sit with a specific sequence of events that played out during this same trip. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle flew into the United Kingdom. They traveled the length of the country. They met privately with King Charles at Highgrove House for what sources describe as barely an hour. They spent 2 nights on a secluded estate, and they departed again. Throughout every stage of it, the British tabloids came up entirely empty. No arrival shots, no departure shots, nothing caught roadside. No telephoto lens finding a gap in the hedgerow. Not even a blurry glimpse of the vehicle carrying them. The security operations surrounding this entire visit held absolutely and totally. Publications that have spent 15 years hunting exactly this kind of material openly conceded the operation had been executed flawlessly. Read that again. The tabloids admitted they got nothing. 0 frames. The most hunted couple in the British press moved through the whole country like ghosts, which quietly demolishes a story we've all absorbed for roughly 6 years running. The narrative the Duke and Duchess of Sussex themselves have advanced repeatedly across interviews, through a Netflix docuseries, and inside Prince Harry's own memoir titled Spare, is that this family can't step foot in Britain without being relentlessly tracked. That privacy is structurally impossible for them on British soil. That the press apparatus makes normal life impossible for them and for their children Archie and Lilibet. Yet here they were, undetected, unphotographed, genuinely private for the full stretch of a multi-day visit. Privacy wasn't just theoretical for this family during this trip. It was actual, demonstrated, proven reality. They had it. They held it in their hands. And then Meghan Markle turned around and released it herself, free of charge on Instagram. Sit with that contradiction because it's genuinely extraordinary. Nobody voluntarily surrenders an asset worth 6 figures purely out of sentiment. You release something like that deliberately when what it buys you outweighs whatever cash figure it carries. Which tells you the photographs themselves were never really the product. The message riding alongside them was. And whatever that underlying message actually communicated, it had precious little to do with laying flowers. Before I press any further, fairness demands room here, because I refuse to be the kind of commentator who feigns certainty where none exists. There's a genuinely plausible reading of this entire sequence where none of it involved calculation whatsoever. Where an uncle simply welcomed his late sister's grandchildren, kids she never got the chance to meet, onto family grounds. Where a father wanted a real, unguarded moment with his children near his mother's resting place. Where a mother shared a photograph afterward without any of the strategic layering critics are about to assign to it. That reading deserves honest consideration alongside everything I'm about to lay out. None of us were standing on that island, and confident certainty in either direction is something no outsider has genuinely earned here. So hold both possibilities together as we move forward, because the truth could sit anywhere between them. Now, the calendar. Because once you line up 2 specific dates side by side, the pattern becomes genuinely impossible to wave off as coincidence. And this is where the story shifts from uncomfortable to something far harder to explain away. Wednesday, July 22nd, 2025. William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, released an official portrait marking their eldest son, Prince George's 13th birthday. The photograph was taken on a Kensington Palace staircase. Understated, warm, the kind of image that does exactly what a birthday photograph is supposed to do, and nothing beyond it. Thursday, July 23rd. 11 images surface from the Duchess of Sussex's Instagram account, exactly 24 hours apart. That's the entire gap separating the 2 posts. 1 day, 1 news cycle, 1 perfectly timed collision. I want to be precise here, because plenty of online commentary has this wrong. Theories bouncing around social media tying the timing to some commercial product launch, linking it to Meghan's honey or jam or wine label, don't hold up under any real scrutiny. That particular lavender honey product had launched 3 full weeks earlier and had already cycled completely out of news coverage. The calendar alignment isn't pointing at retail, it's pointing squarely at a birthday. At the Wales family's birthday. Specifically at the moment when the public's attention was trained most warmly on Prince William's eldest son. Think about that from William's angle for a second. You release a carefully managed, deliberately understated photograph of your 13-year-old. Within 24 hours, the whole news cycle has swiveled to a set of photographs from your brother's wife, taken on the island where your mother is buried, featuring children whose faces you've never publicly shown before. Your birthday post isn't just competing for airtime, it's been structurally shoved aside by it. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This isn't the first time this exact pattern has surfaced. Royal correspondents who track media timing professionally have documented a recurring tendency for Sussex media activity to land within hours of major Wales family milestones. It's a pattern with a paper trail. Not once, not twice, a pattern. Which brings us to the man standing silent on the far shore, Charles Spencer. And I need you to understand something. Most of this week's coverage has badly warped his position. The commentary has quietly demoted him to a footnote inside his own family story. That isn't just inaccurate. It's deeply unfair to a man whose entire relationship with that island is built on 30 years of personal guardianship. This is someone who oversees that burial site personally, the way a sentry oversees a post. When Netflix approached him about filming scenes at Althorp for their dramatization of the royal family, he shut the request down publicly and made clear he found the very idea almost insulting to entertain. He blocked 4 physical breaches over 20 years. He tore out the bridge. He ringed the resting place of his sister with water and marsh, specifically to make sure no one could reach it without his explicit knowledge and consent. And yet, during the second week of July, he apparently welcomed Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, Archie, and Lilibet onto the grounds for an extended stay. The circulating account from sources close to the family claims one specific condition was attached beforehand: absolutely no cameras. If that condition is accurate, what reportedly happened next takes extraordinary nerve. Because here's the loophole, and it's one observers flagged almost immediately. Banning cameras doesn't automatically ban phones. No film crew, no production van, no lighting rig. But apparently, nobody explicitly prohibited a smartphone tucked into a pocket. The letter of the arrangement was honored. The spirit of it was gutted. Now, the landowner himself has offered zero public commentary since these images emerged. Silent Thursday when the photographs appeared. Silent Friday as reaction detonated across every platform. Silent through the entire weekend. Silent through the following week. Still silent right now as I record this, nearly 7 full days later. Meanwhile, his personal social media feed carries nothing more recent than vintage family snapshots. Children on a swing set from 1966. A pony named Teddy Tar photographed in 1972. Nostalgia deployed as a shield. The past used as a wall against the present. That silence carries an enormous amount of interpretive weight in either direction. Either he authorized the visit and is now quietly absorbing a backlash he never anticipated, or he never authorized what followed and has been sitting with a breach of trust so personal that he can't bring himself to address it publicly. Pick a version. Either one lands hard, and I genuinely welcome him clarifying, because the longer that silence stretches, the louder it speaks. A single sentence would end this entire controversy by lunchtime. Something as simple as, "They visited as my guests and I welcomed them gladly." That alone would drain every ounce of oxygen out of this story. Instead, we get a 1966 swing photograph and nothing further. Let me add one more layer here that most coverage has underplayed. King Charles himself reportedly established very specific ground rules for the Highgrove House gathering, which sources describe as barely an hour in length. The conditions were direct and unambiguous. No photographs, no publicity, no interviews. 3 rules. 3 clear boundaries drawn by the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom. A man who also happens to be the grandfather of those 2 children. If you're keeping count, that means 2 separate figures of authority, the king and the earl. Both reportedly set the same fundamental condition before this visit got underway. No images. And somehow 11 of them landed on Instagram within days. Here's what that tells you about power and about how the Sussexes operate inside these family structures. You can set terms. You can draw lines. You can make your expectations unambiguous. And it apparently doesn't matter, because the rules will be observed in their narrowest possible reading and then discarded the moment the phone comes out. That isn't a communication breakdown. That's a pattern of behavior. And it's a pattern that, once you see it documented this clearly, makes you understand precisely why certain doors inside this family have been closing one by one over the past several years. Now, Prince Harry. Because the conversation this week has funneled responsibility almost entirely toward Meghan Markle, and while I understand why that framing works, it lets him off a hook he doesn't deserve to slip. Meghan doesn't actually appear in that photograph. Look again if you're skeptical. She simply isn't present in the frame. What is present is Harry, a boy of roughly 7, a girl of roughly 5, armfuls of flowers, a pathway that his own uncle intentionally made nearly impossible to reach. Nobody understands the significance of that vanished bridge better than Prince Harry. He documented it himself in his own words in his own memoir, Spare, published by Penguin Random House, translated into over 40 languages worldwide. He explained plainly inside that book that the crossing was eliminated specifically to shield his mother from intrusion. He described the water. He described the isolation. He wrote about what that island meant to the Spencer family and to him personally. He then published that exact explanation for the entire world to read. 40 language editions, millions of copies sold. He built the sacred nature of that ground into his own public narrative, his own brand, his own carefully constructed story about who he is and what he has endured. And then he stood on that island with a device somewhere among the group and let the resulting images circle the globe by Thursday afternoon. Here's a considerably harder comparison, and it's one I haven't seen anyone else draw this directly. July 1st, 2017, the date that would have marked Diana's 56th birthday. A modest, private rededication ceremony took place at that exact burial site. Prince William attended. Catherine, then Duchess of Cambridge, was present. Harry stood there too, alongside two of his nephews and niece from the Wales side of the family. The Archbishop of Canterbury personally officiated. Not a single image from that day ever reached the public. Not one. The ceremony was designed to stay fully private, and it did, without anyone needing the arrangement explained or justified or reinforced by threat of consequence. Everyone present simply understood the terms, respected them completely, and went home. 9 years later, Prince Harry retraced that same route under markedly different circumstances. Same ground, same purpose, different outcome. And the distance between those two visits tells you everything you need to know about what shifted in the intervening years. Here's where my analysis breaks sharply from nearly everyone else covering this story. And I want you to hear me out fully before you react, because this part demands that you set aside the comfortable mythology for a few minutes. The prevailing sentiment all week has insisted that this location is sacred ground, untouchable, and that Diana herself would have been horrified by any of it. Plenty of otherwise thoughtful commentators have repeated that claim with total sincerity, and I keep coming back to the same fundamental objection. Some of us actually watched how Diana operated in real time, not through the retrospective filter of documentaries and commemorative specials, but as it was actually unfolding. Diana sat for extended recorded sessions with the author Andrew Morton, working through intermediaries, and effectively handed her entire marital story to the public in book form. That book, Diana, Her True Story, became one of the best-selling nonfiction titles of the 1990s. She cooperated in its creation while publicly denying any involvement whatsoever. Controlled disclosure with plausible deniability built right into the architecture. Then came the Panorama interview in 1995. An hour-long broadcast from inside Kensington Palace, delivered straight to camera, that fundamentally destabilized the institution of the monarchy around her. 3 famous words. There were 3 of us in this marriage. One sentence that rewrote the entire public understanding of the royal family overnight. There were also the notably staged gymnasium photographs, captured through arrangements that were considerably more choreographed than the public was led to believe at the time. Diana understood image management with an intuition that bordered on genius. Very few people who have ever carried a royal title have grasped the mechanics of media manipulation as instinctively as she did. She deployed photography deliberately, strategically, as a weapon against an institution that had systematically shut her out. And it worked spectacularly. It worked so well, in fact, that her story still dominates public conversation more than 28 years after her death, which means the assumption that a photograph at her burial site would have automatically horrified her deserves serious examination before anyone treats it as settled fact. She was the architect of controlled disclosure. She invented the playbook. The idea that she would have been uniformly appalled by its continued use, particularly by her own son's family, assumes a rigidity about privacy that her actual documented behavior does not support. I'm not saying she would have approved. I'm saying that anyone who declares with absolute certainty what Diana would have thought about this is projecting their own sensibility onto a woman whose actual relationship with cameras was far more complicated, far more strategic, and far more willing to bend conventions than the sanitized version of her story generally admits. Let me lay out a framework here that I think clarifies what's actually going on, because without it, you're left reacting to individual incidents without seeing the underlying architecture. Think of public disclosure as sitting on a spectrum. On one end, total privacy. No images, no statements, no public footprint. On the other end, total transparency. Everything shared, nothing withheld. Most public figures live somewhere in the middle, managing what gets out and what stays hidden based on a mix of personal preference, institutional guidance, and strategic calculation. What Diana pioneered in the early 1990s was a specific technique I'd call the controlled breach. You establish an expectation of privacy so firmly that any image which does emerge carries automatic narrative weight. Then, you selectively allow specific images to surface through channels that preserve your deniability. The public receives the photograph. The photograph tells a story. You never have to say a word because the image speaks entirely on your behalf. And if anyone questions the arrangement, you point to the expectation of privacy as evidence of your good intentions. Morton's book worked this way. The Panorama interview worked this way. The gym photographs worked this way. The mechanism is always identical. Build the wall. Open a carefully selected crack. Let the light through. Deny you ever touched the wall at all. Now watch what unfolded at Althorp through that exact lens. An island engineered to be unreachable. An explicit condition of no cameras. An entire security apparatus that successfully prevented any tabloid photography during the trip. Every element of the privacy wall firmly in place. And then, through one carefully chosen crack, 11 photographs emerge on Instagram. Released not by a tabloid, but by the family itself. Selected and cropped and captioned and sequenced for maximum narrative impact. That isn't a privacy failure. That's the controlled breach executed at a level Diana herself would have recognized instantly. The wall was never the point. The crack was always the point. And if you're wondering why Prince William is reportedly seething over an image he has declined to publicly address at all, my read isn't that this is about a lake or a hedge or even flowers specifically. William came of age directly inside the aftermath of that exact media strategy. He watched firsthand, as a boy of 12, what it cost his mother and what it cost his family when controlled disclosure spiraled into something none of them could contain. He then deliberately built his entire adult public life around doing precisely the opposite. Measured, restrained, institutional, often at genuine personal sacrifice. Choosing silence when a well-placed interview could have won him sympathy. Choosing restraint when retaliation would have been understandable. And now, by this reading, he's watching that same technique get revived and pointed back in his direction, wielded by his own sister-in-law, using his own mother's burial site as the stage. Running what amounts to the same playbook Diana created out of genuine desperation in 1992, but repurposed here under entirely different circumstances by someone who critics would argue faces nothing remotely comparable to what Diana actually endured. Call it a disagreement over taste if you want. To plenty of observers paying close attention, it reads considerably more like someone borrowing your mother's exact voice, specifically to talk over you with it. And that's a wound that no public statement, no matter how carefully phrased, can adequately address. Before anyone treats the act of photographing a royal burial site as some kind of universally understood violation, let me introduce a detail that quietly dismantles that entire premise. September 2022. Buckingham Palace itself published an official photograph of the late Queen Elizabeth's memorial stone at the King George VI Memorial Chapel in Windsor. The royal household released that image directly, officially, deliberately. No controversy attached, no outcry, no accusations of desecration. So there's no sweeping, unbreakable taboo governing photographs at royal resting places as a general principle. What exists is one narrow, specific arrangement tied to one particular island. Rooted in 4 documented break-in attempts targeting Diana's actual remains, enforced by one particular man for nearly 3 decades. This isn't a religious prohibition. It's a security protocol born from real, documented threats. And the debate this week isn't about whether graves can ever be photographed. It's about whether the specific terms governing this specific grave were honored or violated by the specific people who were granted access to it. On a related note, this exact burial site has already been at the center of a commercial controversy once before, and Meghan Markle had absolutely nothing to do with it that time. Charles Spencer himself opened the Althorp grounds to paying visitors on his sister's birthday back in 1998, charging roughly $16 per ticket. Elton John publicly condemned the arrangement as thoroughly distasteful. Then there was Diana's image eventually appearing on margarine packaging, an episode that stirred significant public anger at the time, but has been almost entirely forgotten in the current wave of commentary. The history of this grave's relationship to commerce and public access is considerably more complicated than the clean, sacred, untouchable narrative that has dominated this week's coverage. Here's the genuinely strangest thread in this whole affair, and it was surfaced by a royal correspondent who has been tracking Sussex media patterns with real rigor for over a year. The specific window captured in these photographs, the pool time, the family dog, a modest seaside dinner spot, wine, laughter, the golden light of a relaxed summer evening, represents the identical stretch of days that Sussex-aligned sources were simultaneously describing to the press as an unfolding crisis. During that same period, reports circulated about statements being drafted and then quietly retracted, an ongoing standoff with British authorities over security arrangements, claims that the family had to split their travel plans because moving together wasn't considered safe. Prince Harry, according to sources close to the couple, nearly breaking down during a phone call. Meghan reportedly deeply upset throughout. 3 weeks later, that identical window of time has been completely repackaged, rebranded, presented as an idyllic summer holiday with the children, all sunlight and wildflowers and barefoot afternoons. One experienced correspondent described the contradiction with what I think is the single most incisive observation offered in this entire week of coverage. The photo series isn't contradicting the earlier crisis narrative directly, this correspondent noted. It's simply behaving as though the facts were never a relevant consideration to begin with. And that observation lands with real force, because it captures something genuinely unsettling about the broader Sussex communication strategy. You can't fact-check someone who isn't actually building a factual argument. You can't point out contradictions to someone who treats consistency as optional. The photographs don't answer the crisis narrative. They simply overwrite it. And the overwriting itself is treated as sufficient, because for their audience, it apparently is. There's potentially one more layer here that deserves examination, and it may ultimately prove to be the most consequential dimension of this entire episode. Before these photographs ever surfaced publicly, reports were already circulating about a documentary project reportedly in development, timed to line up with the 30th anniversary of Princess Diana's death in 2027. A royal biographer has claimed directly that these specific images may have been captured with that project already in mind. That the entire Althorp visit may have been structured, at least in part, around generating content for a production that would center Diana's story through the lens of her younger son and his family. If there's any substance to that claim, it reframes everything. The flowers become set dressing, the pathway becomes a location scout, the children become cast members in a narrative being assembled around them before they're old enough to consent to participation. And Spencer's ongoing silence may have nothing to do with anger at all. It may simply reflect genuine uncertainty about how to respond to a situation where his cooperation has potentially been converted into production assets without his knowledge or agreement. Consider the commercial arithmetic. A Netflix documentary marking the 30th anniversary of Diana's death, featuring never-before-seen footage of Prince Harry bringing his own children to their grandmother's grave for the very first time. The emotional payload of that content is almost immeasurable. Whatever sum the Sussex Netflix deal originally commanded, footage like that could restructure the entire arrangement. Prince William, by every indication, would be incandescent at the prospect of a documentary about his mother, produced without his involvement or consent. It's his mother, too. A fact that the Sussex media operation has a persistent tendency to minimize. That's a genuinely uncomfortable possibility. And I want to be clear that it remains speculative at this stage, but the question itself is legitimate. Were those cameras rolling for a mother's personal memory, or were they rolling for a production company's content library? Because the answer to that question changes the moral calculus of this entire story from one end to the other. One point deserves proper acknowledgement, rather than simply getting buried beneath the analysis. Regardless of what transpired on that island, regardless of who authorized what or who posted anything, two small children were positioned at the center of an adult conflict. They had zero involvement in creating and no capacity to understand. Archie is around 7 years old, Lilibet is around 5. They were carrying flowers to a grandmother's grave. That act, stripped of every layer of strategic calculation and media manipulation and family politics that adults have since wrapped around it, is actually quite beautiful. A boy carrying flowers for a woman he'll never meet. A girl walking a path her father once walked as a child himself. There's a version of this story where that's all it ever was. And the adults around those children, every single one of them, from the parents who brought them to the uncle who either did or did not authorize entry, to the commentators spending a week dissecting every pixel of a photograph taken from behind, owe it to those kids to at least hold that possibility with some care. That said, the decision to make that private moment public was an adult decision made by adults for adult reasons. The children didn't choose to be photographed. They didn't choose to have those images shared with millions of strangers. They didn't choose to become symbols in an argument about media strategy, family betrayal, and the commodification of grief. That was done to them by the people responsible for protecting them. And no amount of face obscuring or backward angles changes the fundamental nature of that choice. And speaking of faces, here's a detail that the more perceptive observers flagged almost immediately. Not a single face appears in any of these photographs. The children are shown exclusively from behind, side angles at most, a partial profile here and there, but never a full frontal image. The argument being advanced is that this approach somehow protects their privacy, that by withholding the faces, the parents are drawing a meaningful line between public and private. And on a surface level, that logic seems internally consistent. Except, marketing professionals identify the technique instantly for what it actually is. What the Duchess of Sussex is executing, whether consciously or intuitively, is a strategy the advertising industry calls a curiosity gap. By revealing portions of the children gradually, a side angle in one post, a partial profile in another, a silhouette in a third, she's creating a sustained appetite for the full reveal. Every partial glimpse increases the market value of the eventual full photograph. Every deliberate withholding builds demand that will someday be satisfied at a time and place and price of her choosing. That isn't privacy, that's inventory management. The children's faces are not being protected, they're being warehoused. And the difference between those two things is the difference between parental instinct and brand strategy. So let me bring this all the way back to where we started and close every door I opened at the top. Who was holding the phone? We don't know with certainty. But Prince Harry was physically present on that island. He appeared in the photograph. He was carrying flowers on land he devoted an entire chapter of his memoir to describing as deliberately inaccessible. Whatever device captured those images, he was standing right there when the understanding with his uncle, whatever its precise terms, evidently fell apart. The camera didn't walk itself across that water. Why is Charles Spencer silent? Two possibilities, and only two, make logical sense. Either he authorized the visit and is now absorbing consequences he didn't anticipate, unable to publicly defend an arrangement that produced an outcome he never sanctioned. Or he never authorized what actually happened on that island, learned about it Thursday morning alongside the rest of us, and remains too bound by family loyalty or legal counsel or sheer disbelief to address it publicly. His silence is not neutral. Silence from a man who blocked 4 intrusion attempts and publicly rejected Netflix is an extraordinarily loud statement dressed as nothing. Why did this detonate the way it did? Because the photographs proved conclusively, and on the public record, that genuine privacy was entirely available to the Sussex family during this trip. The tabloids got nothing. The security held. Privacy was there for the taking. They had it. They chose to sacrifice it. And they sacrificed it not by accident or through a leak, but through a voluntary, deliberate, carefully curated release on a platform they fully control. That's the privacy paradox at the heart of this story. The people who have built an entire public identity around being denied privacy proved they can have it whenever they want it, and then demonstrated in the same breath that they don't actually want it when its absence serves them better. And what about Diana? Would she have approved? Nobody alive can answer that honestly. But here's what the historical record actually supports, stripped of mythology. Diana was the original architect of the controlled breach. She pioneered the technique of establishing an expectation of privacy and then selectively violating it for strategic advantage. Whether she would have sanctioned this specific application of her method is unknowable. But the idea that she would have been uniformly and categorically appalled by it requires you to ignore roughly half of her documented media history. The truth, as always with Diana, is more complicated and more human than the cleaned-up version. The real question this whole episode forces isn't about taste or protocol or even family loyalty. It's about something considerably larger. What happens when the tools of the powerless get picked up by people who are not, by any reasonable measure, powerless at all? Diana used photography as a weapon because the institution had left her with nothing else. She was cornered, silenced, discarded, and she fought back with the only resource available to her. There's genuine courage in that story, and genuine tragedy. But the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are not cornered. They have a Netflix deal, reportedly worth over $100 million. They have a global platform. They have the ability to command media attention at will, which this entire episode rather dramatically proves. When someone in that position deploys the same strategy Diana used out of desperation, the moral weight of it shifts entirely. What was survival becomes something closer to extraction. And the thing being extracted in this case is access to a resting place that one man has spent 3 decades trying to protect from exactly this kind of use. That's my honest read on all of it. Not the comfortable read, not the popular read in any particular camp, but the one I keep coming back to after a full week of sitting with it. And here's the part that's going to keep this story alive. Long after this week's outrage cycle burns itself out, the 30th anniversary of Diana's death falls in 2027. If there is genuinely a documentary in development, everything we just witnessed may have been the opening sequence. The flowers, the pathway, the children, the golden light, the first frames of a production that could generate a level of family conflict that makes everything to date look like a polite disagreement over seating arrangements at dinner. Which means the silence from Althorp isn't an ending, it's an intermission. And whoever held that phone on the island knows exactly what comes next, even if the rest of us are only beginning to understand the question. Until next time, stay sharp and keep watching the